Thank you for the kind introduction, Rose. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the LSE Research Showcase series. My name is Jan Zglinski. I'm an assistant professor at LSE Law School. And I have the great pleasure to speak to you today about something that is very close to my heart and I suspect might be close to some of your hearts too. Football. Football is often called the beautiful game. And I have the slides to back this up. It gives us incredible moments on the pitch. Here on the left-hand side, you see Ella Toone, for example, during the final of the 2022 Women's Euro, scoring after a perfectly timed run by lobbing over Germany's goalkeeper and contributing to the eventual victory of the Lionesses. Or here on the right-hand side, you see the positive impact that football can also have off the pitch. It contributes to identity building, to social cohesion. It can promote public health, and it even contributes to the global economy as well as the local economy. The picture shows supporters of Sunderland FC immortalized by the Netflix series Sunderland Till I Die, which I understand is in its third season as of today, and really is maybe the poster child, the example of the positive impact that the sport can have on a community and a region more broadly speaking. But more and more, we are also seeing a problematic side of football. Here on the left, you have a photo of Loretta Lynch, then US Attorney General, holding a press conference in May 2015 in which she announces that she will prosecute FIFA, the International Football Federation, for bribery and other various financial offenses under the so-called RICO Act, a statute that had been initially designed to prosecute criminal organizations like the mafia. On the right-hand side, a photo of a coffin prepared by fans of Bury FC in 2020. Bury, one of England's most historical football clubs, had been placed into administrations after years and years of financial mismanagement and various failed rescue attempts, leaving an entire town in shock. Events like these are really the starting point of my talk and the reason behind my talk and my research in this area more broadly. Football is in dire need of reform. It is a sport that's based on antiquated governance structures which do not safeguard transparency, do not safeguard accountability, have problems with representing the stakeholders that need representing. It is a sport that's come into the limelight for other wrong reasons, such as human rights violations. The World Cup in Qatar a year and a bit ago was a forceful reminder of that. Persistent gender inequalities have been marring the sport, sexual abuse scandals, and then we haven't even spoken about the financial sustainability issues within the sport as demonstrated by Bury Football Club, but then also the growing competitive imbalances that we see not just on a national level, such as here in the Premier League, but also at the European and international level, as for example can be seen in the Champions League that's constantly won by the same small number of clubs. We hoped for a long time that problems like these would and could be solved by football authorities themselves. That UEFA, the FA, and the many other football governing bodies would come together or reflect on their own about these many issues and come to a positive change or understand that change was necessary. This appears more and more unlikely. The typical the typical kind of chain of events that we're seeing is that there is a big scandal or a big problem is discussed in the media, then there's announcements about wanting to improve from football dignitaries, and a few months or a few years later, a relapse into old patterns and ostensibly the same problems reappearing again. This vicious cycle of problems has been understood by some lawmakers. We have, over the past few years, seen some very interesting legislative initiatives in Spain, in France, and maybe most prominently here in England, that are in different ways trying to do the same thing, to reform sports more broadly and football in specific by adopting laws that guide football governance, that constrain football governance, that force it to behave in certain ways in which we would expect it to behave. So my idea for today's talk was, I want to reflect a little bit on what we can do. How can we use regulation to improve football governance? And I will be proposing that there's 3 basic things that we can do, 3 routes we can take. But before we get to that, I want to spend a second on looking at how the structure of football currently works. Some of you may be familiar with this, to others it may be new. This, in a nutshell, is the present structure of football governance. I should add, it's also the structure of many other sports. This is sometimes called the pyramid, the football pyramid. What is meant by this is that we have indeed a pyramid-shaped structure which is subdivided into different layers or levels, which are all connected hierarchically. So the top layer has powers over the layer below that, which has hierarchical powers over the layers below that. At the very peak of it all, we find FIFA, the International Football Federation, which is responsible for international games, notably games between national teams. The second level are the so-called continental federations or confederations. UEFA is the responsible European body, but we have the AFC for Asia, CONCACAF for North America, and so on and so forth. And then the layer that we are probably most familiar with on a day-to-day, the national leagues and associations, such as the FA here in England and Wales, and the Premier League and EFL. And below that, regional associations, sub-regional associations, and let's not forget clubs, players, grassroots organizations, because football is a big, big, big phenomenon. Now, I'm showing this to you because ultimately how we have approached football governance for the past century and a half, roughly speaking, was to let this pyramid decide reasonably freely on how it wants to run the game. This is the famous autonomy of sports, autonomy of football. It is rooted in times which are very, very far away at this point. Victorian England, where football was nothing more than a pastime for a few, wealthy private school members who were kicking the ball about on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. Now, the idea of that voluntary association that doesn't really need government intervention has remained strong until today. So this is what regulation could really change. We increase regulatory oversight, legislative oversight, or other forms of oversight over this pyramid structure. Now, how can we do this? I promised 3 suggestions, and I want to deliver on that. Option 1 is cooperation. We could try to influence the behavior of football governing bodies through acting in a certain way, interacting in a certain way with them. Governments, ministries, international organizations, countries more broadly have been having relationships with sports and football since times immemorial, really. And these can take various forms, but one quite classical and quite representative shape they can take are so-called cooperation agreements. And here possibly the best known, at least in Europe, is the cooperation arrangement, that's what it's called, between the European Union and UEFA. And it is representative because it shows how an international organization tries to relate, to interact with the football body with the ultimate objective of improving how it works. So this is meant to be really not just for the for the benefit of the European Union, but also for the benefit of the sport more broadly speaking. When you open this agreement, it reads very beautifully. Both parties commit to protecting good governance, to protecting gender equality, are emphasizing how important a role fans play, that they are the real owners of the sport. They emphasize how incredibly significant maintaining a proper competitive balance is. Yet, there is preciously little substance to back up this beautiful rhetoric. There's no real hard obligations, there's no real concrete commitments that UEFA needs to comply with. So all of this is flowery rhetoric, not much more. And that's a problem. It's not just a problem because it gives UEFA a really significant role in European and international football by being able to sign an agreement with the European Union, which in itself is a very powerful institution. Maybe more problematically, what it does is it repeats all of those nice slogans without really critically evaluating them. It makes it sound as if UEFA indeed was all about good governance, was all about promoting gender equality, etc., etc. What could we do here? Well, the solutions, I think, are quite simple. First of all, we could ask for more in return for that cooperation. And when I say we, I mean the European Union, or applying this to the national level, national governments. We could say, look, we are going to sign this cooperation agreement, we're going to enter into a cooperation with you if and only if you commit to concrete obligations, if we are able to impose concrete benchmarks, which are very well known in international law. If you say that by the year 2028, you will do X, Y, and Z, you will have gender parity, you will have redistributed so and so much money, you will have supported players in this way. Another thing we could do is tie compliance to funding. This is a route that we're quite familiar with here in the UK. We have, since the mid-2010s, a UK Code for Sports Governance, which ostensibly sets down all of the basic principles we would expect a sports federation to comply with, limit the terms of your presidents, have adequate representation, avoid conflicts of interest, etc., etc. Now, many sports get government funding, so what the government here said was, we'll only give you that funding if you comply with some of these basic good governance standards. Either of these would go some way of improving the situation, but I do not want to get your hopes up too much, because there is a big catch. And that big catch is that anything that we're talking about here is what lawyers would call soft law. It's not hard law. These are not legally binding obligations. They ostensibly rely on the goodwill of the actors involved to be enforced. So, the benchmarks, the commitments, it's not that you can go to court to enforce them, or that the police can step into the offices of the Premier League and enforce compliance. They depend on the Premier League wanting to comply with those. Similarly with funding. Football actually isn't funded through the UK Sports of Governance mechanism. Why? Because it already has so much money. This idea of money for reforms, or reforms for money, will forever be a hard sell in what is ultimately the most commercially lucrative sport on the continent and possibly around the world. Which brings me to option 2. Why don't we use litigation? Why don't we harness the power of litigation to effect change? By litigation, I mean bringing court cases or similar formal proceedings in front of national institutions. Well, where could we do that? Domestic courts are one actor which has dealt a lot with football-related disputes. But beyond that, we have European fora as well. The Court of Justice of the European Union has been handling a lot of sports-related cases, especially recently. So has the European Court of Human Rights, which is in Strasbourg. In addition to that, we have a variety of sports arbitration tribunals, which we could also creatively use to accomplish what we want. And how this would look, or what this would look like, is we'd ostensibly initiate court cases in some of these areas that I've listed here. So competition law can form the basis for sports disputes. EU free movement law has been a very frequent basis for those, but at the national level also employment and labor law, as well as state aid provisions. Just to give you 2 out of many, many examples. Here in England in the 1960s, in East Ham versus Newcastle United, a disgruntled player successfully challenged the quite rigid transfer system back then. So there was a kind of retention system which didn't allow players, after their contract with their previous club had expired, to join another team unless a transfer fee was paid. He was successful in overturning this ultimately, and which had a very positive impact on players' wages. And then much more recently, in December of last year, we had the Court of Justice of the EU deciding the famous Super League dispute, in which it ostensibly said that the Super League founders were right in saying that UEFA violated EU competition rules by having too restrictive authorization guidelines for so-called third-party competitions. I'm mentioning these 2 examples just to illustrate what we could do here. We use this kind of format, this kind of tool, and apply it to the many other problems we have and the many other things we would like to see changed. Let's litigate to improve fan rights. Let's litigate to improve gender equality. Let's litigate to redistribute TV money more fairly, to regulate football agents, etc., etc., etc. Now, the good news here is we're quite familiar with this approach, so we know how to do it. That's really a great strategic advantage. But again, there are some more serious disadvantages with this too. Litigation always depends on us having a person bringing a legal challenge that is suitable. That might be the case in some scenarios. In others, we might struggle with finding that suitable litigant. Even if we do find them, any success we will have will only concern that specific problem and will only be happening on a case-by-case basis. We deal with one problem now, another problem in 3 years' time, another problem in 7 years' time, not making it possible to have a real coherent regulatory framework. Courts tend to be quite deferential when they look at rules of sports federations, which makes it a little bit difficult to even challenge them properly, but maybe most problematically. If we succeed in litigation, what's happening is only that we remove a sport rule, remove a football rule. The problem is we don't need fewer rules. We need more rules. We need more and better regulation. Bringing me to my last and final option, legislation. Why don't we adopt a football law? That football law could contain rules about transparency, accountability, diversity, representation, conflicts of interest. If we're more creative, it could have rules on players' rights, on club ownership, on financial sustainability. Sky's the limit. Spain and France have gone down that exact route. France has now gender parity rules that by essentially the end of this year or 2028 in other situations, sports federations need to have an equal number of men and women in executive positions. Spain has reintroduced the possibility for fans to own clubs and for players to go to ordinary courts. Things like that have most famously made it into the UK legislative process. So as we're speaking, a few hundred meters down the road in Westminster, there are discussions about having a dedicated football act here in the UK, which is the result of an independent so-called fan-led review of football governance that was initiated after the Super League fiasco, turned in the meantime into a white paper and might now become binding law. The real crux, at the heart of this legislation is the creation of an independent football regulator. So a body that would be outside of the pyramid I showed to you and oversee the pyramid's operation. When it comes to who's able to own a club, who's able to run it, possibly in the future how finances are being redistributed, already now how financial rules are being applied, and maybe again going forward how much rights and involvement fans can benefit from. No matter which of these routes we take and which exact measures we adopt, football needs reforming, and regulation, be it in the form of cooperation agreements, litigation strategy, or as I have tried to argue, legislation can contribute to that reform process. Regulation shouldn't be seen as a punishment or as a means of destroying the sport, but as a means of fixing some of the many problems it is currently experiencing and is unable to solve itself. It is, in other words, an attempt to do something which is ultimately, to use a slogan popularized by FIFA many moons ago, for the good of the game. Thank you.